This was one of the most difficult videos I've made to date because it is by far the most comprehensive. I'm going to be sharing with you my tips and tricks for miniature furniture making, so you'll want to stick around to the end. Hopefully, you can use some of my miniature building hacks when you're working on your miniature projects. I'm going to be finishing the 1/12 scale kitchen cabinet that I've been working on. I'm going to show you how to build the hutch for this kitchen cabinet. I'll leave a link in the description to the playlist so you can see how I built this miniature from start to finish. Notice the miniature butcher block countertop. I'll be putting a link at the end of this video, so you just need to click it to see how I built this countertop. From cheap garden stakes I purchased at the dollar store. I purchased these garden stakes from the dollar store as well. These are perfect for the hutch because they'll be the exact width I need. Not the right thickness, but the right width anyway. The height of the hutch is going to be 3 inches. That's equivalent to 3 feet using a 1/12 scale. However, I'm going to be cutting these pieces of wood 4 inches long. I'll be telling you about that later in the video because that's another one of my tips and tricks that I'm going to be sharing with you. I'm going to be needing 3 lengths of wood. As I mentioned, the width is perfect, but they're too thin. I'm going to show you how we can fix this problem. This is a trick you can use when you're building your miniatures as well. We're going to be gluing 2 sticks together to create a thicker piece of wood. You need to make sure that you have some clamps on hand when you're gluing the pieces of wood together, or maybe something heavy to lay on the wood to hold them together while the glue dries. Sometimes these pieces of wood aren't always completely flat, and you'll need to use clamps to make sure that there's no gaps when you're gluing the wood together. Apply the wood glue thoroughly to the whole garden stake. You want to make sure that the bond from the glue between the 2 pieces of wood is even throughout the whole length of the wood. I used a scrap piece of wood to spread the glue like butter to make sure I get a complete layer of glue on the piece of wood. You don't want any air pockets left. Next, place another piece of wood on top and use some clamps to hold the wood firmly together. You want to make sure you let the glue dry completely. This is really important because if you don't make sure you've securely clamped the wood, you can get some gaps and you can cause problems when you're building your miniatures. Don't go cheap on clamps. Clamps always come in handy. When you're building miniature, clamps of various sizes and types are a must-have. Here you can see the garden stakes clamped up. I'll let the glue dry overnight before I remove the clamps. You want to make sure that the glue is thoroughly dried before you remove the clamps. The next day, I removed the clamps. I double-checked the height that I want to make the hutch. The hutch is going to be 3 inches high, but I'm going to be cutting the lengths of wood 4 inches long. The cabinet is approximately 3 feet high, 3 inches or in life size 3 feet high. So the height of the cabinet once completed with the hutch will be 6 inches, or in life size that's about 6 feet. I measured out the 4-inch lengths on the wooden garden stakes. I used my square to draw the lines on the wood. Using the bandsaw, I cut the garden stakes to the correct length. I need 2 pieces 4 inches long. These will be the sides of the kitchen hutch. Here you can see how the vertical pieces of the hutch will look on the kitchen cupboard. Here's one of my hacks that hopefully you can use when you're building your miniatures. I put a little dab of glue on each end of these pieces of wood. You don't need a whole lot of glue when you do this. I glued the 2 pieces together like this. I clamped these 2 pieces together and let the glue dry. I'll explain why I did this later in the video, so make sure you stick around. Next, I measured 3 pieces of wood to 3 3/4 inches long. This is going to be the width of the hutch that sits on top of the kitchen cabinet. You need to remember when you're building a hutch on a kitchen cabinet, you don't want the hutch to be the same length as the cabinet. The hutch should be slightly smaller than the kitchen cabinet itself. This will add a bit of interest to your miniature cupboard when it's completed, because this is how it's done on most real kitchen cabinets. Using my bandsaw, I cut the shelves to length. This cupboard will have 2 shelves, but I need the 3rd piece of wood, which is going to be the top of the cabinet. Here's one of my little tricks. I taped the 3 shelves together using some painter's tape. Using my sander, I trim the edges to make sure that I get all these pieces of wood exactly the same length. I held the wood against the miter guide on my sander to make sure I get a perfect 90-degree angle. The pieces of painter's tape will hold the wood together while I trim them with the sander, and they'll all be the identical size. When I removed the painter's tape from the 3 pieces of wood, I took the same piece of tape and placed the painter's tape on the wood lengthwise. I then used the belt sander to touch up the edges of the wood to make them nice and smooth. This will look much better when the wood is painted. Remember, there's going to be a bit of a seam on each edge of the shelves because we made the wood thicker by gluing 2 garden stakes together to create a thicker piece of wood. I just want to sand out the edges a bit to make sure that seam is less prominent. Hey, if you're enjoying my video, please hit the like button. Maybe even consider subscribing. That'd be awesome. And if you could leave a comment, I'd really appreciate that. As a small YouTube creator, it really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. Here you can see the wood shelves on the top are all identical. They're all the identical length and identical width. Then I added a little bit more tape around the edges. Using my cheap acrylic paint from the dollar store, I painted the edges of these pieces of wood. This is another trick you can use when you have multiple pieces of wood or parts that you need to paint for your miniatures. If you only need to paint the edge and all the pieces are identical like this, you can tape them together tightly and paint the edge of all 3 pieces of wood at the same time while not getting paint on the rest of the part. This is important because the top of the shelves are not going to be painted yellow. They're going to be stained to match the butcher block countertop of the kitchen cabinet. Make sure you don't use big globs of paint because you don't want to run the risk of the paint running between the cracks. I let the paint dry thoroughly, then remove the painter's tape. You can see here the paint is pretty much only on the edge. The bottom of these shelves will be painted yellow, and the top surface is going to be stained to match the butcher block countertop. I'm using the same wood stain that I used on the countertop. Here you can see the stain being applied to the shelves of the kitchen cabinet hutch. There were little bits of wood and sawdust on the shelves, so after staining them, I used some paper towel to wipe these bits off. Here you can see the kitchen hutch shelves which have been stained. They look pretty good. I removed the 2 pieces of wood I'd glued together from the bench clamp. These pieces of wood will form the sides of the kitchen hutch. I measured in 1/2 inch from each end of the piece of wood. Remember, the wood's 4 inches long and I only want the hutch to be 3 inches high. Using my straight edge, I drew a line. The center part of the piece of wood is 3 inches long and it will be my working area. Remember, I put a bead of glue on each end of these pieces of wood to hold them together. I'm using this popsicle stick, which is going to be the trim that runs along the top of the hutch. I remeasured the usable usable space and divided it into 3 parts. There's going to be 2 shelves in the hutch and the top panel. Here you can see the width of the shelves. Remember, I glued 2 of these garden stakes together to add extra thickness to the wood. I then drew a line down my workable area. This will be the depth I want the curves to be on each side of the kitchen hutch. I drew some angles freehand, but I needed to get something a little bit more accurate. I looked for a template that was round so that I could trace out a nice arc. I tried using a highlighter, but it didn't really work. Then I found a dime and that worked perfectly. So I traced the arcs using a dime as a template. I shaded in these areas that I need to cut out, and using my bandsaw I cut out the curves in the wood so that I could sand these areas out easier. If you have a jigsaw, that'll work really well, but I only have a bandsaw. Here you can see the curved sections that I've cut out of the side panels of the kitchen hutch. I did this for all 3 curves that you need to cut out. I attached some parchment paper to the table of my drill press in order to keep my work clean because the drill press table tends to be a bit oily. I'm using some clamps to hold the parchment paper to the table. I raised the table up so the sanding bit is level with the table of the drill press. Using the drill press as a sander, I cleaned up the curves in the wood, making them nice and smooth. If you don't have a drill press, you can use a Dremel tool instead. Place your wood into a clamp and carefully hold your Dremel tool to smooth the curves. Be really careful when you're doing this freehand. You need to make sure your wood is securely clamped in place. Here you can see the 3 curves have all been sanded and are nice and smooth. Here's the rest of the hack I talked about earlier. Remember how I put a little bit of glue on each end of these 2 pieces of wood that are being used for the vertical parts of the kitchen hutch? Well, I'm cutting the glued portions off. And now you can see I can take the 2 pieces apart and both pieces are exactly the same. My angles, my curves, everything is identical on both pieces. I have an exact copy. Hopefully you'll be able to use this trick somewhere when you're building your miniature models. Using some acrylic paint, I painted the top panel of the hutch along with the vertical pieces. This is another little trick that'll help you when you're building your miniatures. Try to paint the pieces of wood before you assemble them. This will make your projects look much better because you won't get any excess paint on the areas where you don't want it. It would be a terrible shame if I assembled the hutch first and then tried to paint it because it would be difficult to paint the hutch without getting any paint onto the beautiful butcher block that I put so much time and effort into building. It was time to glue up the hutch. I'm using some bar clamps, and I have a couple of pieces of wood which I'll also use to try and get everything straight as possible when gluing the hutch together. The wooden blocks will help make sure that the bar clamps keep the hutch true and square. It needs to be true and square so it sits flat on the top of the kitchen cabinet. I put some glue on some paper towel because I don't want to have excess glue on my project. These are the 3 pieces of wood I'm using. The one that's yellow on both sides is going to be the top of the hutch, and the other 2, which are stained on one side and painted on the other, will be the shelves. I checked using my square to make sure everything was at a right angle. I'm using another bar clamp, clamped in the opposite direction, to hold the shelves tight while the glue dries. I let the glue dry overnight and then I removed the clamps. Here you can see how the hutch will look sitting on top of the kitchen cabinet. Here it is in the pantry and it's already looking pretty good. I'm using some popsicle sticks to add a bit of trim to the top of the hutch. I'm using a bit of glue to glue these pieces of trim in place. You don't want to use too much glue, but you do need to make sure you use enough glue that you get a good coating so the pieces of wood don't come apart in the future. I place the trim on the sides of the hutch first. I want the piece of wood on the front to overlap the pieces on the side so you don't see the end parts of the wood looking at the hutch from the front. Remember, the front of the hutch is the main surface that you'll be looking at. So as a tip, when you're adding trim, always make sure you think about which is the front surface of your project because you want to have as few joints on the front as possible. I'm using my sander to trim down the popsicle sticks, but you could use sandpaper or an X-Acto knife to trim these pieces of wood to the correct lengths as well. I put a bit of glue on the front piece of trim on the hutch and used my bench clamp to hold this piece firmly together while the glue dried. I purchased some triangular shaped wood at the dollar store. I'm going to add this trim to the top of the popsicle stick around the top of the hutch to add a bit more detail to the cabinet. I need to cut the corners at a 45-degree angle so that the pieces fit together nicely. I set the miter guide on my bandsaw to 45 degrees so I could get an accurate cut. I carefully cut off the end of the trim using the bandsaw. I glued this piece of trim to the top of the kitchen hutch. I placed the piece of trim a little bit higher than the popsicle stick because I want to add a little bit more depth to the top of the cabinet. I'm adding another piece of wood to the top to give the top of the hutch a smooth, flat surface. I glued this piece of wood to the top of the hutch. I'm making the back part of the hutch using a thin piece of craft wood that I purchased at the dollar store. I measured the piece of the wood so it just covers the back of the hutch. I'm using the bandsaw to cut the piece of wood to width. I've drawn a line to show which part of the wood is behind the hutch and which part is behind the cupboard. I'm going to be making the wood extra long because I'm going to use it to secure the hutch to the kitchen cabinet. I'm making some marks on the wood 1/4 of an inch apart. I'm drawing some lines vertically on the part of the wood that's behind the hutch. I want to add a bit more interest by making it look like the back of the hutch is actually made out of separate boards. So for the first go round, I'm using my utility knife to score these lines into the wood. I need to make these cuts in the wood more prominent, so I'm starting out using my utility knife. I used a nail which has a bigger point to try and open up these thin grooves that I used making the utility knife. I then used a nail set which has an even bigger point at the end to make these cuts of wood even more prominent. Here you can see the grooves in the wood. I painted the back panel using the same yellow acrylic paint I used to paint the other parts of the project. You'll notice as I'm painting that you can see the grooves in the wood and they're starting to show up quite nicely. I also painted the top of the hutch as well. I used some wood filler to fill in the gaps and smoothen out the top of the cabinet. After the paint dried on the hutch, I sprayed the hutch using some satin finish lacquer, the same stuff I used on the kitchen cabinet portion of this project. Here you can see the paint and lacquer has dried, and I'm going to be gluing the back panel onto the hutch. I'm carefully spreading the glue onto the back of the hutch. You don't want too much glue, but you need enough glue so that it doesn't come apart. Make sure you remove any excess glue. I carefully laid the hutch onto the back panel. I used a couple of clamps to hold everything in place. Here's another one of my tips. Make sure you use some flat, clean pieces of wood and don't put any clamps directly onto the finished project because you could damage the painted finish. After the glue dried, I removed the hutch from the clamps. Here you can see the hutch with the markings I put on the back panel of the hutch, making it look like individual boards. It really makes the project look so much better and so much realistic. I added some glue onto the bottom part of the hutch. This will hold the hutch to the kitchen cabinet without having to put any glue on the butcher block countertop. I'm going to be putting a link at the end of this video showing you how I made that butcher block countertop. Check it out if you're interested. Once everything was in position, I carefully turned over the kitchen cabinet and laid it on a clean towel so I didn't scratch or damage it. I used my utility stapler to staple the wood into the back of the cabinet. This will keep everything in place while the glue dries. And there you have it. The kitchen cabinet is in the pantry of the miniature Sears Craftsman kit house. It looks really good. And there's the link to the video I told you about, the one where I showed you how I made the butcher block countertop for this miniature kitchen cabinet. Give it a click and check it out. We'll see you in the next video.